Let's take a close look at the anatomy of this block before we go to place blocks 6, 7, and 8. These blocks are our critical blocks, the ones that are going to be used for matching points. So if you would look right here, this is between blocks 4 and 7. And over here is between blocks 5 and 6. This joint right here, this seam line, is a critical matching point, as is this one on each segment. We also have a critical matching point on section 8, but we'll get to that later. And the reason why I'm talking to you about this now, before we put piece 6, 7, and 8 on, is I want to give you a little tip. And that is this. Normally we don't stitch into the seam line. We just stitch to the end of the block. But in this case, we want those to really lay flat to help us match those lines up. So what I do is I place my ruler on the seam line and on the stitching line, and I extend it on both sides into the seam. I don't know whether you can see that or not. Let me make that a little darker so that it shows up a little bit better for you. Okay, now I think you can see it. So I'm going to start stitching clear out here and end my stitching clear down there when I sew these two pieces together. And that's going to make sure that they don't move or shift while I'm trying to stitch these segments together. I'm going to do the same thing over here between segment 5 and 6. I'm going to extend that line also all the way into the seam line. But make sure when you're doing this that you are staying on the line. Now while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with section 8. We're going to put a ruler down against the existing stitching line and draw all the way through. So we're going to go ahead and mark those up first, and then we'll continue stitching. So let's start with piece 6. Let's place right sides together, making sure that this side and this side are both into the seam allowance. Just kind of center this block, and we're going to flip it over. Now this time, instead of starting on this edge like we always do, we're going to start back here on the extended line that we just drew. And we're going to follow that through all the way down. Now here's another tip for you. Let's just take that piece 6 and fold it back loosely and put a pin in it. Now we can take piece 7 and also place it on the line for stitching. Again, make sure that you're out into the seam allowance on both sides. Flip it over, and when you're ready to stitch it, Make sure that you're stitching on the extended line that goes into the seam allowance. Now we've been able to put both piece 6 and 7 on there, which is even more of a time saving. So I'll catch back up with you when we get the rest of these stitched, and we'll go to the next step. So now we have all our blocks with pieces 6 and 7 attached. The only thing that we need to do with this now is to press it open. So we're going to press each one of these and when we're done with that, we're going to do a little trimming before we add piece 8. So we'll be back with you as soon as we get these pressed. We now have our stack of foundation piecing. It's all been pressed. The only thing remaining to do is to trim this piece to make allowance for the last piece that goes on, which is piece 8. So we're going to flip these over and we're going to start to trim. We'll put our cardstock along this stitching line for piece 8. Trim that away. So now it should look like that. And we're going to continue doing that until we get through the stack again. So once again, this will probably take, well, maybe 5 minutes. And when we're done trimming, we'll be ready to add the last piece. Down to the wire now, we're ready for piece 8. And by the way, I cheated a little bit when I cut out piece 8. I just cut a 1.5 by 2 inch rectangle instead of worrying about cutting a triangular piece. I just cut strips that were 1.5 inches wide and just cut 2-inch segments. That made the cutting go a little bit easier. Since we're into the speed process right now, I just thought I'd share that tip with you. So we're going to take this now and we're going to put our right sides together, making sure that we extend through both sides. We're going to flip this over. And again, we're going to stitch on our extended line that we drew all the way through. We've got that. We'll fold it back and you can see it more than covers. So we'll continue on with that. Putting in our final piece 8, right sides together, making sure we've extended into the seam allowance, flip it over, make sure we're stitching on that extended line that we drew. And I'll catch you on the flip side when I get all these stitched. So another 10-minute interval has passed and we have all of the piece 8s stitched down to our foundation piece. And now all that's left to do is to press that flat. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll press from the front. We'll press from the back. And we'll keep going. Press it over. Press from the front. Press from the back. And move on. I'll be back with you as soon as I get this stack of 24 blocks pressed. Another 10 minutes later, and we have our finished stack of pressed blocks with all the pieces required to make it. Our last step is to trim around the entire block to allow for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're going to do that by placing our ruler down, and we're not using the add a 1/4 this time, we're using a regular ruler. I'm placing the 1/4 inch mark on the dark black line that goes around the block to make sure I'm getting a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to trim. I'm going to flip it around, do the same thing, put the 1/4 inch line on the dark square line, and trim. Turn it around, 1/4 inch, and trim. And the last side. Now it's important that you're indeed doing this at a 1/4 of an inch all the way around. This is going to help when you come time to put these all together. And you'll notice that the extended lines that we drew go all the way through the seam allowance, and that's going to help us too. So I'm going to go ahead and trim up the rest of these blocks, and I'll be back. And through the magic of video, we now have 24 segments. Now I want to show you something. Because we stitched the matching points down into the seam line, here, 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 and here, we don't have to worry so much about accurate pinning, gluing, anything like that to get these to match up. Now, the only thing we have to worry about is making sure that we have the red triangles together, and we want to make sure that we are placing these pieces so that this edge right here is exactly lined up. And we're going to put a pin in there to hold that in place. Now we're going to come around to the other side, or the other end, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make sure that this is lined up exactly with the edge, like that, and we're going to put a pin in there. Now we're simply going to stitch. So we're going to start in on the square a little bit, take a couple stitches, back up, remove the pin when you get close to it. Remember, that pin is just put any place. We're just holding these outer edges together. Now, let me show you why we did that. That's because if you look at this side, I'm stitched right on the line. If we look at this side, I'm stitched right on the line. When I open up my block, voila, my points are matching exactly the way they should be. No fuss, no muss. Let's open this up a little bit so you can see even better. So it's matching perfectly there, and it's matching perfectly there. So those who are fretting over matching up these smaller Bethette blocks, this is the way to do it. So I'm going to continue putting those together. I'm going to show you that one more time. We've got 2 blocks. We're going to line up so that the red triangles are together. The only thing I'm concerned about at this point is to make sure that this edge right here, these raw edges, are lined up exactly. And that's so that when I sew this 1/4 inch seam, it's going to sew a 1/4 inch on this side and also be exactly on the 1/4 inch line on the back piece. And I think that's why so many people have been off a little bit on this block, because although you're stitching on the line here, somehow it goes off on the back piece. So let's go ahead and stitch this. Stitch on the block a couple stitches. Let's back up. And let's keep going. So we're on the 1/4 inch line here. We're on the 1/4 inch line here. Let's open it up. And we have another perfectly matched block. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of these together. Actually, I'm going to stop at this point because you see how I'm doing it. Let's go ahead and press so that you can see another easy way to press these to make these seams lay a little flatter on these smaller blocks. This is a seam stick. It's a piece of wood. It's a hardwood. It's got a rounded edge, and there's a little sock that covers it. But because of the rounded edge, when you put your seam down and you're pressing against wood, it really presses this seam really flat. We're just going to hold the iron there for a minute and press hard against the wood. Then we're going to go on this side. We're going to do the same thing. Now you can see how nice and flat that makes that seam. We're now on the final round of speed piecing. We've put the 2 half sections together and we're ready to sew those together so that we will end up with one complete block. So we're going to do these just like we did putting the halves together. We've got the pins on the edges to keep the raw edges even, just like we did before. And we're going to stitch down on this line. We're going to take the next one. Back up a little bit. Always make sure before you come to the center seam that it's laying flat in the back also. You certainly wouldn't want that to flip and add to your bulk. So let's continue on. if you need to hold that down, you can use the seam ripper for something other than ripping out seams, because they don't match, because now they should all match for you. Let's grab the next block. And we're just going to continue on this way, making sure that these edges are even. And why are we doing that? We're doing that so that not only are we sewing on the 1/4 inch line on this side, but by making sure that that is even, we're assuring that we're also sewing on the 1/4 inch line on the opposite side. By doing that, we're guaranteeing ourselves some success in matching those critical points. Between that and the fact that we stitched those seams clear out into the seam line. Okay, we got the next to the last one here, and we're almost done with 6 of these blocks. Now we have 26 to go. So you can see this didn't really take a whole long time. If we can do 6 this quickly, it surely won't take long to do 26. So speed piecing is definitely the answer when you're making so many blocks and they're all the same. It's almost like a no-brainer way of stitching. You just don't have to think about it. You become a robot and you just sew, press, and trim. Sew, press, and trim. Now this is our final block, because we've already done the one, so we're almost ready for our great reveal. Okay, let's cut these all apart. And let's see what we have. Looks good to me. Looking good. No muss, no fuss. And we have squares in the middle. Imagine that. Now all that's left to do is to press, and we'll be done with these blocks. So there we are. We have all 6 blocks done. All 6 blocks match, and they went pretty quick. I hope you like this method.